This is PolitiPod's set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023, DC Indictment Edition, with your host, Matt Nisenoff.
Welcome. We told you it would be soon. Here's PolitiPod's set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023, the DC Indictment, American Continued Carnage, the I Alone Can Fix It edition. Once again, we join you with our reading and take on the latest indictment of Donald J. Trump. Honestly, we never left. We'll stop when he stops getting indicted. For this indictment, we have our indictment reader, Erika Klemmt-Ginsberg. I'm your host, Matt Nisenoff, along with fellow Opinionators and Snarkologists, Bickle and GD Fenderson. Erika, we kick it off with you.
The acting Deputy Attorney General promptly responded to co-conspirator 4 by email and told him that his proposed letter was false, writing, "Despite dramatic claims to the contrary, we have not seen the type of fraud that calls into question the reported and certified results of the election." In a meeting shortly thereafter, the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General again directed co-conspirator 4 not to have unauthorized contact with the White House.
Despite repeated warnings for Jeffrey Clark to not have unauthorized contact with Trump, Clark did not heed those warnings, and now he has cooties.
Co-conspirator 4 is sure to listen about not having unauthorized contact any day now, perhaps after the pivot.
Yes, Jeffrey Clark. When Bill Barr isn't corrupt enough, it's like switching from X-Lax to liquid Drano.
On December 31st, the defendants summoned to the Oval Office the acting Attorney General, acting Deputy Attorney General, and other advisors. In the meeting, the defendant again raised claims about election fraud that Justice Department officials already had told him were not true, and that the senior Justice Department officials reiterated were false, and suggested he might change the leadership in the Justice Department.
Trump, in essence, said, if you won't tell the lies I want told, then I will I have found someone who will.
On January 2nd, 2021, just 4 days before Congress's certification proceeding, co-conspirator 4 tried to coerce the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General to sign and send co-conspirator 4's draft letter, which contained false statements to state officials. He told them that the defendant was considering making co-conspirator 4 the new acting Attorney General, but that co-conspirator 4 would decline the defendant's offer if the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General would agree to send the proposed letter to the targeted states. The Justice Department officials refused.
Clark wants credit for the scheme, but not blame for the scheme.
This was after co-conspirator 4's first plan, which was to say he'd tell the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General's moms if they didn't sign what he wanted them to sign.
The next morning, on January 3rd, despite having uncovered no additional evidence of election fraud, co-conspirator 4 sent to a Justice Department colleague an edited version of his draft letter to the states, which included a change from its previous claim that the Justice Department had concerns to a stronger false claim that as of today, there is evidence of significant irregularities that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states.
His first lie wasn't lie-y enough. Libel enough? He needed more liability? No. What do you call it when a lie needs less truth?
After Justice Department leaders had refused to sign the letter, co-conspirator 4 felt that the best course of action was to strengthen the false claim in the letter, like speeding up to hit a lamppost.
Also on the morning of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 met with the defendant at the White House, again without having informed senior Justice Department officials, and accepted the defendant's offer that he become acting Attorney General.
I'm sure Clark said something like, "It would be an honor to be more dishonorable."
The pivot's coming any day now.
On the afternoon of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 spoke with a deputy White House counsel. The previous month, the deputy White House counsel had informed the defendant that there is no world, there is no option in which you do not leave the White House on January 20th. Now, the same deputy White House counsel tried to dissuade co-conspirator 4 from assuming the role of acting attorney general. The deputy White House counsel reiterated to co-conspirator 4 that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, and that if the defendant remained in office nonetheless, there would be riots in every major city in the United States. Co-conspirator 4 responded, "Well, Deputy White House counsel? Well, Deputy White House counsel, that's why there's an Insurrection Act."
If the people get mad and try to steal back the election that we stole, then we will send the military that Trump disrespects to quash the people that Trump disrespects. It's called the coup d'etat democracy.
It's not the act, it's when the entire play is done that it makes any sense.
Jeffrey Clark was welcoming riots in major American cities. I think we all know who the real tyrant is here. Anthony Fauci.
Also that afternoon, co-conspirator 4 met with the acting attorney general and told him that the defendant had decided to put co-conspirator 4 in charge of the Justice Department. The acting attorney general responded that he would not accept being fired by a subordinate and immediately scheduled a meeting with the defendant for that evening.
That's like Colonel Sanders being fired by Popeye, a sailor.
I think the real hero in this mess is the HR department.
On the evening of January 3rd, the defendant met for a briefing on an overseas national security issue with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior national security advisors. The chairman briefed the defendant on the issue, which had previously arisen in December, as well as possible ways the defendant could handle it. When the chairman and another advisor recommended that the defendant take no action because Inauguration Day was only 17 days away and any course of action could trigger something unhelpful, the defendant calmly agreed, stating, "Yeah, you're right. It's too late for us. We're going to give it to the next guy."
Trump was obviously distracted thinking about lunch. That's the only explanation for him being temporarily reasonable.
To be fair, it was a decision that didn't put cash directly in his pocket.
The defendant moved immediately from this national security briefing to the meeting that the acting attorney general had requested earlier that day, which included co-conspirator 4, the acting attorney general, the acting deputy attorney general, the Justice Department's assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel, the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, and a senior advisor. At the meeting, the defendant expressed frustration with the acting attorney general for failing to do anything to overturn the election results. And the group discussed co-conspirator 4's plans to investigate purported election fraud and to send his proposed letters to state officials, a copy of which was provided to the defendant during the meeting. The defendant relented in his plan to replace the acting attorney general with co-conspirator 4 only when he was told that it would result in mass resignations at the Justice Department and of his own White House counsel.
Trump, to avoid a mass resignation, agreed to not make Clark acting AG and to act like he was acting on his actual acting AG's advice while acting outside of the norms set by the acting AG.
At the meeting in the Oval Office on the night of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 suggested that the Justice Department should opine that the vice president could exceed his lawful authority during the certification proceeding and change the election outcome. When the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel began to explain why the Justice Department should not do so, the defendant said, "No one here should be talking to the vice president. I'm talking to the vice president, and ended the discussion.
Trump called Pence and asked if Pence could hang out with Trump later or hang out with 1,000 of Trump's friends much later.
Pro-choice. Yeah.
Pro-choice. You can hang yourself or we'll hang you.
The defendant's attempts to enlist the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding. As the January 6th congressional certification proceeding approached and other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function failed, the defendant sought to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification to fraudulently alter the election results. The defendant did this by first using knowingly false claims of election fraud to convince the vice president to accept the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than count them. When that failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C. to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results.
Say hello to my little fiends.
The crowd was just hanging for Pence.
On December 19th, 2020, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington, D.C. on the day of the certification proceeding, tweeting, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild." Throughout late December, he repeatedly urged his supporters to come to Washington for January 6th.
And he offered free palm hair remover to the first 1,000 knuckle draggers.
Remember Trump tweets? They give you a particular nostalgia, like a wartime groin injury that still aches when it rains.
On December 23rd, the defendant retweeted a memo entitled Operation Pence Card, which falsely asserted that the vice president could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from 6 targeted states.
The Pence card is like the race card, but with none of the pigment and all of the privilege.
He had to retweet it because he would never get to the point where he typed someone else's name.
On the same day, co-conspirator 2 circulated a 2-page memorandum outlining a plan for the vice president to unlawfully declare the defendant the certified winner of the presidential election. In the memorandum, co-conspirator 2 claimed that 7 states had transmitted 2 slates of electors and proposed that the vice president announce that because of the ongoing disputes in 7 states, there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. Next, co-conspirator 2 proposed steps that he acknowledged violated the ECA, advocating that, in the end, Pence then gavels President Trump as reelected. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11th, co-conspirator 2 had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided the vice president discretion in the counting of electoral votes or permitted him to make the determination on his own.
The 7 states were denial, delusion, anger, depression, liquid, solid, and gas, hot air.
Co-conspirator 2's backup plan was that Santa could deliver it if Pence wouldn't.
On several private phone calls in late December and early January, the defendant repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud and directly pressured the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding on January 6th to fraudulently overturn the results of the election, and the vice president resisted, including A. On December 25th, when the vice president called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas, The defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th and his request that the vice president reject electoral votes that day. The vice president pushed back, telling the defendant, as the vice president already had in previous conversations, "You know, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome." B. On December 29th, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, the defendant falsely told the vice president that the, quote, Justice Department was finding major infractions, unquote. C. On January 1st, the defendant called the vice president and berated him because he had learned that the vice president had opposed a lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that, at the certification, the vice president had the authority to reject or return votes to the states under the Constitution. The vice president responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority and that it was improper. In response, the defendant told the vice president, "You're too honest." Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceeding, tweeting, "The big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Location details to follow. Stop the steal." D. On January 3rd, the defendant again told the vice president that at the certification proceeding, the vice president had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The vice president responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected the lawsuit making the claim the previous day.
If only Krampus wasn't president. No. I'm sorry. Of all the things that Trump would eventually call Pence, too honest was the most dishonest.
The constitutional version of, "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you." Krampus, that brings us back to the third period.
PolitiPod, set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023 with your host, Matt Nisenoff, will return after this brief message.
Hi, I'm Jacob Nisenoff, and I'm one of the people who make PolitiPod, the podcast. Yeah, the political podcast that you haven't listened to yet. We are a group of people who have fun with politics, governance, and more. We alone can save you from making your own political humor podcast. Our writers put together one-liners, sketches, and even a small amount of information on upcoming elections every 2 weeks. You can find out what we have done the last 7 years by going to the soundcloud.com/politipod, or just visit on any Tuesday to see if it's one of the Tuesdays we have a new episode. However you want to do it, feel free to enjoy the laugh and be on your way. Thanks for listening to me. Now go listen to your new political humor podcast of choice, PolitiPod. We're at soundcloud.com/politipod.
And now back to PolitiPod, set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023 with your host, Matt Nisenoff.
On January 3rd, co-conspirator 2 circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the ECA, the vice president would send the elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count.
To determine which Democratic votes to erase, the black ones.
On January 4th, the defendant held a meeting with co-conspirator 2, the vice president's chief of staff, and the vice president's counsel for the purpose of convincing the vice president, based on the defendant's knowingly false claims of election fraud, that the vice president should reject or send to the states Biden's legitimate electoral votes rather than count them. The defendant deliberately excluded his White House counsel from the meeting because the White House counsel previously had pushed back on the defendant's false claim of election fraud.
Pence must have felt like an underage girl at a Jeffrey Epstein party.
During the meeting, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, bottom line, won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes, and we won every state, and asked, regarding a claim his senior Justice Department officials previously had told him was false, including as recently as the night before, "What about the 205,000 votes more in Pennsylvania than voters?" The defendant and co-conspirator 2 then asked the vice president to either unilaterally reject the legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states or send the question of which slate was legitimate to the target states' legislatures. When the vice president challenged co-conspirator 2 on whether the proposal to return the question to the states was defensible, co-conspirator 2 responded, "Well, nobody's tested it before." The vice president then told the defendant, "Did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying that I have the authority." The defendant responded, "That's okay. I prefer the other suggestion of the vice president rejecting the electors unilaterally."
Trump wanted Pence to unilaterally reject the legitimate electors as if they were a gay son.
Also on January 4th, when co-conspirator 2 acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told co-conspirator 2, "You're going to cause riots in the streets." Co-conspirator 2 responded that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. After that conversation, the senior advisor notified the defendant that co-conspirator 2 had conceded that his plan was not going to work.
Riots in the street, that is what we want. No democracy. A king is what we want.
Fuck co-conspirator number 2.
On the morning of January 5th, at the defendant's direction, the vice president's chief of staff and the vice president's counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. Co-conspirator 2 now advocated that the vice president do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before, unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. During this meeting, co-conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the vice president's counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by Supreme Court. The vice president's counsel expressed to co-conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets.
Deny the rights of the others.
Isn't there a street in front of co-conspirator 2's house?
That same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6th, and he set the false expectation that the vice president had the authority to and might use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweets. A. At 11:06 a.m., the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was within 40 minutes of the defendant's earlier reminder, "See you in D.C." B. At 5:05 p.m., Washington is being inundated with people who don't want to see an election victory stolen. Our country has had enough. They won't take it anymore. We hear you and love you, from the Oval Office. C. At 5:43 p.m., I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds.
BYOS, bring your own shit.
Also on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the vice president. When the vice president refused to agree to the defendant's request that he obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the vice president that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him. Upon learning of this, the vice president's chief of staff was concerned for the vice president's safety and alerted the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail.
Pence must have felt like one of Trump's sons, Eric.
Because that's when he figured out there was a problem with the guy called the Orange Menace.
As crowds began to gather in Washington and were audible from the Oval Office, the defendant remarked to advisors that the crowd the following day on January 6th was going to be angry.
Not enough porta potties, and they couldn't get a cross-burning permit.
After only months of gaslighting, who could have known?
That night, the defendant approved and caused the defendant's campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the vice president only hours earlier was false. The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act.
Pence must have felt like Trump's fourth wife. How do I get out of this relationship in one piece?
On January 6th, starting in the early morning hours, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the vice president to fraudulently alter the election outcome and raised publicly the false expectation that the vice president might do so. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, quote, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." At 8:17 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated, quote, "States want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage."
Again, those states are denial, delusion, anger, depression, liquid, solid, and gas. Hot air.
I don't think courage means what he thinks it means.
On the morning of January 6th, an agent of the defendant contacted a U.S. senator to ask him to hand-deliver documents to the vice president. The agent then facilitated the receipt by the senator's staff of the fraudulent certificates signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which were believed not to have been delivered to the vice president or archivist by mail. When one of the senator's staffers contacted a staffer for the vice president by text message to arrange for delivery of what the senator's staffer had been told were alternate slates of electors from Michigan and Wisconsin, because archivists didn't receive them, the vice president's staffer rejected them.
Senator Ron Johnson later denied having any memory of anything to do with anything from anywhere all at once.
Rejected them in the way you reject taking out the trash when you know it has cockroaches in it.
At 11:15 a.m., the defendant called the vice president and again pressured him to fraudulently reject or return Biden's legitimate electoral votes. The vice president again refused. Immediately after the call, the defendant decided to single out the vice president in public remarks he would make within the hour, reinserting language that he had personally drafted earlier that morning, falsely claiming that the vice president had authority to send electoral votes to the states, but that advisors had previously successfully advocated be removed.
After Trump singled out Pence in his speech, Eric too wanted to be publicly singled out for anything.
The defendant was also doing this to practice his ability to mentally change the status of government items.
Earlier that morning, the defendant had selected co-conspirator 2 to join co-conspirator 1 in giving public remarks before his own. When they did so, based on knowingly false election fraud claims, co-conspirator 1 and co-conspirator 2 intensified pressure on the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification proceeding. Co-conspirator 1 told the crowd that the vice president could cast the ECA aside and unilaterally decide on the validity of these crooked ballots. He also lied when he claimed to have letters from 5 legislatures begging us to send elector slates to the legislatures for review and called for trial by combat. B. Co-conspirator 2 told the crowd, all we're demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question.
Of course, Giuliani would run from combat faster than a bad dye job down the side of his face. And of course, Trump's bone spurs would return as soon as the battle began.
Co-conspirator 1, of course, called for trial by combat, as is tradition, by other people's children.
Next, beginning at 11:56 a.m., the defendant made multiple knowingly false statements integral to his criminal plans to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' right to vote and have their votes counted. The defendant repeated false claims of election fraud, gave false hopes that the vice president might change the election outcome, and directed the crowd in front of him to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. The defendant's knowingly false statements for these purposes included: A. The defendant falsely claimed that, based on fraud, the vice president could alter the outcome of the election results, stating, I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope if Mike Pence does the right thing, if Mike Pence does the right election, all he has to do, election. All he has to do. This is from the number one, or certainly one of the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers. He has the absolute right to do it. He has the absolute right to protect our country, support our country, protect our country, support our country, support our constitution, and protect our constitution. States want to revote. The states want to defrauded. The states got false information. They given voted false information. Now they want to recertify. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. All Vice President Pence has to do. All Vice President Pence has to do to recertify. Send it back to the states. We become president, and you are the happiest people. And you are the happiest people. After the defendant falsely stated that the Pennsylvania legislature want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify their votes. But the only way that can happen is if Mike. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. Send it back. Send it back. The defendant also said that regular rules no longer applied. C. Stating, and fraud breaks up everything. Is this correct? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. That feels a little weird. Finally, like what is that? After exhorting capital C, we fight. Defendant. We fight.
Yeah,
like
that's
hell.
no, that's
And
it
if you
shouldn't
don't
go
fight
there.
like
It should
hell,
be
you're not going to have a country
you have
anymore.
to send it back. It should
The
just say C,
directed the people in front of him
and then
to
D.
head to the Capitol.
Okay, let me
Suggested
take
he
out
was
105
going with
Capitol.
them and told
Yeah,
them to give
105,
members of
yeah,
Congress
105.
the kind of pride and boldness
gotta go
that
somewhere.
they need to take back
Probably
It goes that Trump may have lied to the people. The people who lied with Trump woke up with fleas.
The crooked treating democracy like a bad bread roll. Send it back.
PolitiPod, set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023 with your host, Matt Nisenoff, will return after this brief message.
PolitiPod contributor Rhonda Handsome is an award-winning director and comedian. Catch her Monday nights on Sirius XM Channel 127 when she joins John Fugelsang's Tell Me Everything, #HandsomeMonday.
And now back to PolitiPod, set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023 with your host, Matt Nisenoff.
During and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched towards the Capitol
To catch the early tour and shop at the gift store.
The defendant's exploitation of the violence and chaos at the Capitol Shortly before 1 p.m., the vice president issued a public statement explaining that his role as president of the Senate at the certification proceeding that was about to begin did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not.
Had he done it on TikTok to hip hop, people would have paid attention and repeated the challenge.
Before the defendant had finished speaking, a crowd began to gather at the Capitol. Thereafter, a mass of people, including individuals who had traveled to Washington and to the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through barriers cordoning off the Capitol grounds and advancing on the building, including by violently attacking law enforcement officers trying to secure it.
All the while screaming, "Buy one, get one at the gift store!"
And thinking how cool it was to be living Ayn Rand's dreams.
The defendant, who had returned to the White House after concluding his remarks, watched events at the Capitol unfold on the television in the dining room next to the Oval Office.
It was like the Macy's parade, except the float was watching from the White House TV as the crowd marched on.
And because he can't comprehend things unless he sees it on a correct TV channel.
At 2:13 p.m., after more than an hour of steady, violent advancement, the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building,
Singing "Give Peace a Chance" and throwing holy water on the walls.
In the touristy way people should start using as they visit Mar-a-Lago. They'll love you for it.
Upon receiving news that individuals had breached the Capitol, the defendant's advisors told him that there was a riot there and that rioters had breached the building. When advisors urged the defendant to issue a calming message aimed at the rioters, the defendant refused, instead repeatedly remarking that the people at the Capitol were angry because the election had been stolen.
And that rioters are black.
After all, he heard it said on television.
At 2:24 p.m., after advisors had left the defendant alone in his dining room, the defendant issued a tweet intended to further delay and obstruct the certification. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a correct set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones, which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth.
Trump was heard saying, "Come on, I'm almost there."
1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the United States Secret Service was forced to evacuate the vice president to a secure location.
To hide him from an insecure boss.
But her emails.
At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence. Where is Pence? Bring him out. And Traitor Pence."
And Mike Pence, have you heard the good news?
And the Heritage Foundation had made it all possible.
The defendant repeatedly refused to approve a message directing rioters to leave the Capitol, as urged by his most senior advisors, including the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, the chief of staff, a deputy chief of staff, a senior advisor. Instead, the defendant issued 2 tweets that did not ask rioters to leave the Capitol, but instead falsely suggested that the crowd at the Capitol was being peaceful, including A. At 2:38 p.m., please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful. B. At 3:13 p.m., I'm asking everyone at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. Thank you.
Trump's request to stay peaceful was heeded by Stuart Rhodes, who was in a hotel waiting for Trump to call for martial law.
To current Republicans, Law and Order is just a TV show.
Dum dum.
At 3 p.m., the defendant had a phone call with the minority leader of the United States House of Representatives. The defendant told the minority leader that the crowd at the Capitol was more upset about the election than the minority leader was.
Kevin McCarthy wanted the violence to end so that he could kiss Trump's end.
You know, like the minority leader didn't believe in the protection by tinfoil either.
At 4:17 p.m., the defendant released a video message on Twitter that he had just taped in the White House Rose Garden. In it, the defendant repeated the knowingly false claim that, quote, "we had an election that was stolen from us," unquote, and finally asked individuals to leave the Capitol while telling them that they were very special and that we love you.
After Trump made his video, he asked for a cup of gravy to wash down the bad taste.
You know, the defendant loves you in that way, which doesn't extend to his helping you in your future trial.
Right.
After the 4:17 p.m. tweet, as the defendant joined others in the outer Oval Office to watch the attack on the Capitol on television, the defendant said, "See, this is what happens when they try to steal an election. These people are angry. These people are really angry about it. This is what happens."
See how mad Antifa and those undercover FBI agents are?
At 6:01 p.m., the defendant tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever."
This is our December 7th, our Alamo, our other thing that we will remember forever. I just can't think of it right now.
Just don't remember too many details when the FBI shows up. I don't remember.
New trial, who dis?
On the eve of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 1 attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to convince them based on knowingly false claims of election fraud, to delay the certification, including A, the defendant, through White House aides, attempted to reach 2 United States senators at 6 p.m. B, from 6:59 p.m. until 7:18 p.m., co-conspirator 1 placed calls to 5 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative. C, co-conspirator 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for 6 United States senators, whom the defendant had directed co-conspirator 1 to call, and attempted to enlist in further delaying the certification. D, in one of the calls, co-conspirator 1 left a voicemail intended for a U.S. senator that said, "We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we get ourselves into tomorrow. Ideally until the end of tomorrow." E, in another message intended for another United States senator, co-conspirator 1 repeated knowingly false allegations of election fraud, including that the vote counts certified by the states to Congress were incorrect, and that the governors who had certified knew they were incorrect, that illegal immigrants had voted in substantial numbers in Arizona, and that Georgia gave you a number in which 65,000 people who were underage voted. Co-conspirator 1 also claimed that the vice president's actions had been surprising and asked the senator to object to every state and kind of spread this out a little bit like a filibuster.
Senator Cruz would later ask for a 10-day hold on the proceedings from the Senate floor after it was safe to come out from the peaceful protests in the Capitol.
Weirdly enough, co-conspirator 1 also tried to reach Georgia officials again to see if he could get the phone numbers of the 65,000 underage voters. No reason.
At 7:01 p.m., while co-conspirator 1 was calling United States senators on behalf of the defendant, The White House counsel called the defendant to ask him to withdraw any objections and allow the certification. The defendant refused.
The coup isn't over until the fat fart sings.
The attack on the Capitol obstructed and delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours until the Senate and House of Representatives came back into session separately at 8:06 p.m. and 9:02 p.m. respectively, and came together in a joint session at 11:35 p.m.
Many GOP Trump supporters were glad that the peaceful protest was over.
And thus the land of Trumpistan dissolved in 6 hours, unlike any of his ice cream-based desserts ever had.
At 11:44 p.m., co-conspirator 2 emailed the vice president's counsel, advocating that the vice president violate the law and seek further delay of the certification. Co-conspirator 2 wrote, "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to allow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here."
The email was replied to by an auto response. The vice president is in an undisclosed location. If this is an emergency, please let Trump know. Thank you.
The PS read, "Please hang your boss on the receipt of this email. Thank you. Yours in Christ."
At 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, as president of the Senate, the vice president announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden.
Mike Pence put on his big boy pants because his other pants were soiled as hell and did his job.
As any conservative, Pence stuck with the status quo. And for once, it was the right thing to do.
The defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to affect the object of the conspiracy alleged above in paragraphs 13, 15, 16, 18, 20, 24, 26, 28, 30 to 33, 35, 37 to 39, 41, 43 to 44, 46, 50, 52, 54, 56, 57 to 64, 67, 71 to 75, 78 to 82, 84, 85, 87 to 97, 99 to 100, 102 to 104, 111, 114, 116, 118, 119, and 122 in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 371.
He did more, but we keep running out of numbers of all the statutes he broke.
Okay, let's recap. No.
Count 2. Conspiracy to object an official proceeding, 18 U.S.C. Section 1512K. Section the allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 125. The allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 re-alleged and fully incorporated here by reference.
And here by the KFC on the table next to the Diet Cokes.
From on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 7th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant Donald J. Trump did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators, known and unknown to the grand jury, to corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral vote, in violation of Title 18, the U.S. Code, Section 1512C2. In violation of Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1512K.
And he is innocent until proven guilty. But if you've been paying attention, he's guilty as fuck.
Count 3. Obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, 18 U.S.C. Sections 1512C2. 2. And the allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are re-alleged and fully incorporated herein by reference.
There's nothing up my sleeve. Presto.
From on or about November 14, 2020 through on or about January 7, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, attempted to and did corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral vote. in violation of Title 18 U.S. Code Sections 1512C2 and 2.
Of course, he could not have pulled this off by himself. Like, he needs help with his pants, his socks, and shoes.
Count 4, conspiracy against rights, 18 U.S.C. Section 241. The allegations contained in paragraph 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are realleged and fully incorporated here by reference.
That the story that you have just heard is true. The names have been changed so that we can pretend that we don't know who did it.
From on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 20th, 2021, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators, known and unknown to the grand jury, to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate one or more persons in the free exercise and enjoyment of a right and privilege secured to them by the Constitution and laws of the United States, that is, the right to vote and to have one's vote counted, in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 241.
If only there was a way that citizens could get together and make their voice heard through some kind of secret ballot and have the ballots counted.
I've heard of Robert Mueller. Why?
Jack Smith, Special Counsel, United States Department of Justice, a true bill.
This has been PolitiPod's set up to be Let Down Indictment Watch 2023. The DC Indictment. American Continued Carnage. The I Alone Can Fix It edition. Thank you for having joined PolitiPod entities Erika Klemmt-Ginsberg, GD Fenderson, Tom Bickle, and Matt Nisenoff. Until next indictment, and we're planning on that being next week.
Breaking news, Georgia just in. This just in from Georgia.
Georgia with the steel chair.
We'll still have the same clothes on for the next edition.
Right.
Dun, 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 dun. Oh shit, I forgot to hit record, guys.
One more time.